Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Well, howdy folks, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of Grimdark in tabletop wargaming. What is it? Where did it come from? Where's it going? And is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? Now, what got me thinking about this was reading an article recently about the new tabletop game Trench Crusade, which, and I'm paraphrasing here, made some comment to the effect that Trench Crusade has taken over Grimdark from where GW essentially dropped it, or something to that effect. So Grimdark is an aesthetic description for a fantasy sci-fi genre that has been called the anti-Tolkien approach. In Tolkien, there's plenty of war, there's death, there's destruction, but it's always undergirded by hope, by heroism, and by the belief that good will ultimately triumph over evil. In Grimdark, however, there's nothing but war, death, and destruction. No heroes, no hope, and without any clear distinctions between good and evil. There's no quote-unquote good guys and bad guys in Grimdark. Everyone has dark secrets, questionable behaviors, or things that make you just a little bit uncertain about them. It's more of a pick your poison rather than a clearly defined good versus evil. Now, the term itself, Grimdark, comes from the tagline to Warhammer 40k. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Now, I'm not an expert on 40k lore, and there are plenty of channels out there that can fill in all the details. But as Games Workshop developed their 40k game and the model lines that came with it in the 1980s and 90s, they did so on this foundation of Grimdark. Every faction had questionable elements to it, some more than others, but even the Space Marines and the Imperial Guard, the faction that represents humanity, has some pretty disturbing things in it, like the process of taking a child and turning him into a Space Marine, or the corpse starch rations that are fed to the Imperial Guard. It was actually kind of liberating having this thing of Grimdark, because without clear lines between good guys and bad guys, players could pick the army they wanted to play, pick the army that resonated with them somehow, whether it be because of a color scheme, a backstory, models, playstyle, but there was no kind of pressure or incentive to play the quote-unquote good guys or the bad guys. I mean, there's even a popular meme in 40k that it's one of the few metaverses that the fans would never want to live in the world that they play. Star Wars fans, J.R.R. Tolkien fans, Battletech fans, all of them wouldn't mind living in their respective universes, but there is no way I would ever want to actually live in the 41st millennium. Now that's how you know you've got Grimdark. Players want to play in the world, but certainly not live in it. In addition to the moral ambiguity, another big benefit of Grimdark is that it made conflict perpetual. There was no fear, and perhaps not even a possibility, for warfare to ever end. Unlike in Tolkien, for example, where we know that either the ring will be destroyed and the good guys will win, or it won't and the bad guys will win. But either way, the war will end and someone will triumph. In a Grimdark world, it's more like how soldiers in the trenches of World War I felt. It's just endless, perpetual fighting. Neither side can get an advantage, thus nobody's going to win, and so the war just drags on and on. That's Grimdark. Now, as GW developed this concept of Grimdark, the 40k world, especially the art of the 40k world, reflected Grimdark beautifully. And you have artists like John Blanche who come to be synonymous with the concept. The pictures that filled the pages of early rulebooks and codexes really gave life to this world where there was near endless and eternal conflict. Hope was just a word in the dictionary, and life was, as Hobbes would say, nasty, brutish, and short. But then things changed. In the early 2000s, Games Workshop went in a different direction. The goal was to take 40k from a global but still niche sci-fi world and to make it mainstream. Kind of like what happened with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which went from a line of very niche comic books to an absolute staple in Western pop culture. But in order to go mainstream, Ninja Turtles had to make some very big changes. Some of the changes were relatively minor. Each turtle got a colored bandana so it was more easy to tell them apart, rather than in the comic books where they all wear red. But other changes were a lot more significant, like the removal of killing. The Foot Clan were turned into robots so that the turtles could smash and bash ad nauseum. But that was okay, because they're just robots. In the comic books, the turtles kill people because they're ninjas, and ninjas are assassins. And it would be very, very difficult to go mainstream and sell lunchboxes to kids when the character on the lunchbox is a 15-year-old who kills. Try marketing that. So Archie Comics bought out Eastman and Laird, and the rest is history. Now sure, there's been ebb and flow with how gritty or violent the franchise gets between the various movies and video games and things of that nature, but it's never gone back to what it was originally. The same thing is happening with Games Workshop. The company wants to go mainstream. It wants to go from being sold only at local gaming stores to being sold at Target, Barnes & Noble, and other big box retailers. But in order to sell to a mass audience, you have to, well, essentially tone down things to avoid alienating potential groups of customers. This means shifting the lore from no clear good or bad guy to now the Imperium is good, Chaos is bad, and the Xenos are kind of the wild cards in between. You go from the grim darkness of John Blanche to this. It's not just the image. You've got here friends enjoying a cup of joe. I mean, that's not very grimdark, but look at the art itself. It's very cartoonish, it's very bright. It's the opposite of what grimdark is. You also have the launching of Games Workshop's children novels set in both the Age of Sigmar and the Warhammer 40k universe. You have toning down models for armies like Slaanesh, and you have other adjustments here and there to make the game and the metaverse a little bit more palatable. Now, to be fair, GW has not wholly abandoned grimdark. Read the Horus Heresy novels, for example, and you'll still find plenty of grimdark, hopelessness, and eternal war. The GW animated shows on Warhammer Plus are also not exactly what you plan to find on Cartoon Network. What GW is trying to do, it seems, is straddle the fence, present a kindler, gentler face to the parents who are buying stuff for their kids, while still providing what the older generation that grew up in the grimdark actually wants. To me, that's like trying to serve two masters, and eventually one will win out over the other. And if a company like GW, I don't imagine they're going to sacrifice their bottom line to maintain the integrity of the lore. We need only look at some recent changes to the lore to see they won't do that. As a bit of a tangent, but still tied to it, I just read another article about a documentary that's being made dedicated to examining grimdark as it developed in 40k. Now, this isn't being made officially by Games Workshop. Here's the interesting part. The film stars Jon Heder. For those of you who don't know, that's Napoleon Dynamite. And when I first saw that, I thought, well, that's pretty cool. Heder always plays a really nerdy guy in every film of his I've ever seen, so it doesn't surprise me that he plays 40k. But then I was in for a bit of a surprise. Heder doesn't play 40k. Or if he does, his character in the film certainly doesn't. But I did a quick internet search to see if he actually played or had any association, and all I got back from a simple Google search was references to this documentary. So I'm guessing the unfamiliarity isn't just for his character. It's the hook of the film. The film is about a guy who's totally ignorant of 40k, trying to figure out what this whole grimdark thing is all about. And the article even specifically mentions that it's being done from this perspective to be more quote-unquote accessible to the uninformed viewer. So that's interesting. A film about grimdark is being made from the perspective of someone who is totally unfamiliar with it, using a celebrity who doesn't actually know about the concept, but will help draw in larger crowds. That to me sounds very much like what Games Workshop is doing as a whole, Grimdark may be held up as the destination, so to speak, but the road to the destination is getting wider and wider and wider. Now, I'm not opposed to efforts to bring people into tabletop wargaming. I'm just afraid we might be seeing the Disney effect, which is to ruin the objective in your attempts to make it appeal to more people. So it seems that Games Workshop is trying to walk along two divergent paths to hold up Grimdark, which is the core of their IP, while at the same time trying to tone it down to make more people interested in the game and in the Warhammer worlds. Now, at the same time, let's take a look at two other games that also take on this idea of grimdarkness in one way or another. And each one is, I think, kind of the end of the road of those two paths that GW is walking. So first, let's start with one-page rules. One-page rules began when a 40k fan got really tired of the rules bloat and the power creep that infests 40k like a Nurgle plague. And so they made up their own set of rules that was, at its very core, very similar to 40k and was initially meant to just be played in the 40k universe. The title of the game was Grimdark Future, clearly taken from the 40k tagline. The game was meant to simplify the rules of 40k but maintain the gritty, violent, dark nature of the 40k world. But then, one-page rules started getting big. And over the decade or so of its existence, one-page rules has created their own line of STL files and models, developed their own unique factions, even created their own separate lore, but they've kept the name Grimdark Future, obviously because that was the initial name, and a brand change like that could be catastrophic for business. In the summer of 2024, they released a world book that formally established the lore of the one-page rules universe, and it was anything but grimdark. Yes, there's always someone fighting someone, but according to the lore book itself, the prospect of total warfare between entire factions has largely been avoided. There is no war in the inner sphere, and some worlds specialize in tourism. The art of the world book even reflects this. Now, don't get me wrong, the art is beautiful, but it's not grimdark, and some of it is downright cheerful and wholesome. It's like grimdark with parental controls turned on, or for you older listeners, it's like watching the television premiere of an R-rated movie. Yeah, it's the movie, it has the characters, it has the story, it has the action, but the swearing, the blood, the nudity has all been removed for television because younger audiences might be watching. So it's the movie, but it's not the movie. Now, some players in one-page rules really like this lighter setting. Others think it's getting a little bit too Disneyland, and by that I just mean it's a small world and hugs and smiles and all that good stuff. My concern ties back to what I said earlier. True grimdark means endless war, which means the game, the stories, the conflicts will always be there. But in a world like one-page rules, the way it's described in their lore book, it's not endless and constant war. It's more like Dungeons and Dragons or Tolkien. Yes, there's war and conflict at specific times, but there's also times of prolonged peace, which for a war game or for a grimdark setting is a heck of a lot more limiting. So if one-page rules represents the much kindler, gentler face of grimdark, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got Trench Crusade. And if you want a world that's totally devoid of hope, filled with darkness, and gritty to the core, play Trench Crusade. The lore of Trench Crusade combines the medieval crusades with the First World War. The backstory is that during the First Crusade, the Templar Knights opened up a gateway into hell, turning Earth into the front line of the eternal war between heaven and hell. And the war has raged non-stop from the 11th century to the 20th. For 900 years, there has been continual warfare, and neither side has been able to achieve any significant advantage over the other. It's just been 9 centuries of absolute carnage. They've even managed to bring back the ambiguity of good and evil, and that's impressive considering that in this game, one side of the conflict is God and the other side is the devil. Just take a look at some of the forces that fight against the army of hell. Those don't look exactly like warm and fuzzy and angelic creatures. This isn't like Diablo, where the high heavens are beautiful and shining while the burning hells are just a raging inferno all the time. In fact, if you weren't totally familiar with the story behind the game, and you were to just see pictures of the various units, models, and art, you'd be hard-pressed to tell me which side were the ones fighting for God and which were the ones fighting for the devil. Take, for example, this guy. He's part of the armies that fight against hell. And if we continue to look at the art from the webpage, the rulebook, the other downloadable files, that is Grimdark. The artists who drew these even said in an interview that they wanted to create and design completely unfettered. And some of the stuff they come up with is downright harrowing. Several of the folks who worked on Trench Crusade have been writers and artists for Games Workshop back in the days when it was still Grimdark. And in this game, they have outdone themselves. Remember when I said earlier that a mark of grimdarkness, at least to me, was wanting to play in the universe, but never live in it? That describes Trench Crusade perfectly. It sounds like a fantastic game to play in, but I would never in a million years actually want to live in that alternate reality. If I were given the choice between having to spend the rest of my life in the 41st millennium or in Trench Crusade, I'd take 40K. I think I'd have a better time. So in the end, it seems like we might have a bit of a spectrum here. At the one end, you've got one-page rules, which calls itself Grimdark, but it really isn't. And at the other end, you've got Trench Crusade, which is grimdarkness without any kind of filters whatsoever. And oddly enough, in the middle is where you find Games Workshop, the OG, the source of Grimdark, trying to decide which way it's going to lean. So what do you think? Where will GW end up on the spectrum? How much Grimdark do you think is the right amount? Does Trench Crusade go overboard? Does one-page rules go a little bit too light? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, keep your dice on the table.